whenever there were large morning walks, I got to go anyway in the van. But this one particular morning stands out in my mind very strongly because I think it's probably the first time I ever spoke to His Divine Grace. I was very nervous of Srila Prabhupada. I was a young devotee, and I thought only Americans could speak to him. At that time, it was all the American devotees were interacting, and we were all younger devotees, the Welsh and English devotees, and felt somewhat more intimidated. So I was afraid to speak to Prabhupada, and I also thought, well, what's there to say? He's speaking, I'm just listening, basically. But on this one particular morning, I felt he said something, and I felt inclined to ask my first question from Srila Prabhupada. And it was in relation to him walking through St. James's Park. There's some nice photographs in black and white that I see sometimes. Ripatananda and Swami, myself, Prabhupada, and I think the driver, one of the devotees, there were just 3 or 4 of us walking. And there were some young hippies sleeping on the park benches in their sleeping bags, and as Prabhupada walked past them, he commented, by good fortune, these can all come to Krishna consciousness. And he carried on walking, and just this word good fortune kept going around in my mind. Does this mean that there's some kind of luck involved here, that somebody gets Krishna consciousness, somebody else doesn't, by some throw of the dice? And in my neophyte stage, I was trying to understand what did Prabhupada mean by good fortune specifically. So after a few hundred yards, I plucked up the courage and tried to phrase my question in such a way that wasn't offensive, and very nervously asked, Srila Prabhupada, when you say by good fortune, can you explain that, please? Because I understand from reading your literature and hearing you speak that nothing happens by chance. That was my angle. So by good fortune, what do you mean? So he continued to walk for a little bit, and all of a sudden he stopped dead in his tracks and frightened me, actually, because he turned straight into my face with about a few inches apart, maybe 12 inches something. And with his walking stick hand, he picked up his walking stick and he pointed right in my face. And he said, we are their good fortune. So I understood from that I had to preach in the future. And I've meditated on that for years and years and years. But actually, Prabhupada has been, in his humility, he never said, I am their good fortune, but we are their good fortune. So I began to pick up the understanding more deeply about the importance of spreading Krishna consciousness. We were talking with Srila Prabhupada, and Ripatananda was remembering that he'd worked in Prabhupada was talking about Ugra Karma and how people work so hard and they get no result for it, and etc., and how difficult it is for them. So Ripatananda Swami began to speak about how he used to work in a canning factory in California before he was a devotee for some period of time. And he began to describe in detail, some detail at least, what it was like to work in this hellish factory. So I'd been around a couple of years now, I was a bit more confident, so I felt, even though a little shy and nervous, I still thought, well, I have a little something to say here. And I began to talk to Prabhupada about how I worked in a steel factory for a few weeks or a month or so when I was about 19, 20, a year or so before I met Srila Prabhupada. And I began to describe it in some detail. There was this huge press, and there were 2 people working on this press, and our only job was to lift up the metal guard of the press and take one huge sheet of steel and put it into the press and pull down the guard and press the button, and this big press would come down and make this piece of steel into a shape of a bath. And then we'd walk around the other side of the press, huge hydraulic press, and lift up the guard and take out the bath and throw it onto a conveyor belt and pull down the guard and walk around the other side and lift up the guard and put in the steel and pull down the guard and press the button, and the press would come down and go around the other. So I was speaking, and Prabhupada was listening and watching and smiling, not smiling, but listening carefully. And I said that then I was doing quite well, Prabhupada. They invited me to work night shift. You got extra money on night shift. So that's what I thought, that I was such a good worker. Actually, it was nobody wanted to do it. but there was a little extra pay, so I thought I'd try. And I found after 1 or 2 weeks that I nearly had a nervous breakdown. I was actually working all night. I couldn't sleep during the day. And because I was such a sense gratifier, I would always go out in the night with my friends, so then I'd go from there to work. So after a couple of weeks of this, I almost had a nervous breakdown from the strain. And Prabhupada listened, and then he was thinking, and he said, actually, that's because in your last life you were all Brahmins. And everyone was sort of looking. There were about 10 people in the room. And he said, actually, otherwise, how could you so quickly come to the platform of Krishna consciousness? And then he stopped and he thought for a little longer. He was leaning on his cushions. He was in a very relaxed mood, leaning back on his cushions with this table. I think it was this same table in front of him at the time. And he was relaxed. He was leaning back and thinking. And then he said, actually, my Guru Maharaj has ordered you all to take birth to help me spread this mission. So everyone's ears are popping up. And then he looked around across everyone in the room, and he finished. I was sitting here with Ribatanandan, and he looked across everyone, and he finished on me because I was the last one to speak to him. And he said, and now we are all together again. And as he said that, he just beamed. And he had his hand behind his head as he does, Prabhupada. And now we are all together again. And he beamed, and everyone just went, Jai Prabhupada, and some devotees began to cry. I remember one story, and I just read it, confirmed, in Harisori's third part of his diary. There I organized the Janmastami, and I think it was the first time that we'd arranged to have paying for some prasadam. And generally we had a big booth and there would be prasadam distributed everywhere. But this one year I thought, well, why not make some little extra prasadam special and then charge somebody who doesn't want to take, the basic rice chapati and sabji. They may want some pizzas or something, chips or something different. And we're not able to serve prasadam the whole time, so we'll keep. So anyhow, I made this arrangement for a little, or somebody did, but I was president, so I was feeling responsible with it. And later on, I was up in Prabhupada's room, and there was darshan, kirtan, and at the end, so Prabhupada said, any questions? And one guest quite strongly began to criticize and complain that why you are selling prasadam? Prasadam is prasadam, it should be given away. So my heart started pounding, I panicked, I'm standing at the back. And Prabhupada is looking, and he looks around, and he said, actually, and then Prabhupada said to him, I think Harisori's got the exact word for word, but basically Prabhupada said, if we don't charge you, then you'll never give anything. So I felt completely vindicated that it was okay to sell some prasadam at the temple. In Harisori's book, Prabhupada says something that actually you are meant to give to support, but you don't give, therefore we charge you something, otherwise you'll never give anything. So that was he had to be quiet then after that. But he was, I remember the Indian gentleman, he was a particularly complaining type. He was always there though, he always used to come regularly, so I thought I was a little nervous in case Prabhupada took issue with me that we were selling prasadam. But he accepted that was okay. Well, some of the instructions I absorbed from his morning walks were two important ones, I think. One was in relation to book distributions. We had some discussion about distributing records and collecting. And Prabhupada, there was quite some discussion about that, but Prabhupada made it very, very clear at that particular time, that was about 1974 also, that if you use some paraphernalia to collect funds, that is okay, but still there must be some book given. He was not at all in favor of just collecting. He said, I'm not a beggar. I never begged anything. Whenever I took some donation, I gave some literature. So I remember that was very strong. Gyanadas and myself and a few were discussing that with him one morning. Another morning, walking through the village and around the fields here, we talked about cleanliness. And one devotee thought he was doing the right thing. He piped up and said that in the Edinburgh temple, we exterminated all of the, because Prabhupada was talking about if you're not clean, then some rats and mice and things will come. So one devotee, without thinking very clearly, I don't think, just piped up and said, oh, we had all the rats and mice exterminated, killed in the Edinburgh temple. And Prabhupada turned on him quite strongly and said, you should be killed. I won't mention the devotee's name. He's a nice devotee, but Prabhupada was very angry that they exterminated vermin. His point was that the temple should be so spotless that what will they come for? There's nothing to eat. So next time Prabhupada visited, many devotees had gone to the airport, and I felt, well, I'll stay here and I'll make sure that everything's nice here for the arrival. I won't go this time. And so I did that, but while I was organizing everything, I went and made a fruit offering for Prabhupada. And when he arrived, the devotees all came after the greeting. They all came up into his room. And I came in quite quickly after with this nice silver plate of all these different fruits that I prepared. And there's a little room in front of the table, so I offered the prasadam to the Boga at that time, and then paid my obeisances. And as I was on the floor, Malati piped up, Srila Prabhupada, Bhajahari has taken a wife since you were here last. And of course, I was struggling for 2 years to remain brahmachari, and in my mind at that time I'd fallen down, I'd got married. You know how we used to sometimes think that getting married was a step backwards in spiritual life and all that paranoia and things. So I'm thinking, oh Malati, you know why, give us a break. But she said it with so much enthusiasm and joy that everyone said Jai, and as I looked up, all embarrassed, Srila Prabhupada was looking at me and he smiled and he said, that's all right. One wife, that is brahmachari life. So I felt, again, Prabhupada was always encouraging, you know. Another nice story, one time Prabhupada was here and he wasn't very well, as I remember, but still he wanted to go and visit Radha Landaneshwara. It must have been 73 or 4. It was earlier on. So we arranged the vehicle. I think it was the only time I ever drove Srila Prabhupada in the car. So we drove down to Berry Place, and many devotees were there, and after greeting the deities, Prabhupada sat on his Vyasasana, and he said, there's a song about Radharani, you know? And Yogeshwara was there. And he tried to sing the song, Radhe Jaya Jaya Madhava Daite. But he got about that far, and it was obvious he didn't know any more words, so he was trying to sing, and Prabhupada was sitting smiling. And so Prabhupada took over and began to sing, Radhe Jaya Jaya Madhava. And so he sang, and we were trying to follow with him, because we'd not heard it before. Or even if we had, we didn't really know it very well. And then Kirtan, he went into Kirtan, Hare Krishna Kirtan, and I remember very clearly this particular day. So that after he rose from the Vyasasana, he was going to leave the temple, and devotees made way for Prabhupada, and I just ducked out first through the door because I wanted to put his slippers on. So as I got out the door, Prabhupada came into the doorway, and at Berry Place it was not a very big doorway, it was just big enough for one person or maybe two to go through together. So Prabhupada was standing in the doorway, and all the devotees were behind him, chanting and dancing and leaping in ecstasy. I mean, it really was a blissful kirtan. And as Prabhupada got to the door, Yogeshwar shouted out, Srila Prabhupada, you are Radharani's mercy personified. And all the devotees went, Jai. And I was just at that moment putting Srila Prabhupada's slippers on. And I thought, I'm going to look up and see how he reacts to that. Yeah, so I looked up. And as I looked up, Prabhupada looked down at me, and I won't try to imitate him, but I'm trying to feel how he said it. But he said, Radharani's mercy contaminated. I was the only one that I know, because there was a full kirtan behind him. So I was just spent the last 20 years trying to meditate on, understand Prabhupada's humility to say that, but then I also wonder sometimes whether he was talking to me, that I'm touching his feet, and now I'm right around his mercy contaminated. So there's different ways to look at everything, as we know. And try to see both sides of that one. Another time I was at Berry Place, before I was asked to be in charge at the manor, I was, for some short period, trying to organize Berry Place. At that time I was approached by a senior devotee who wanted to complain to Prabhupada about the GBC, and he didn't, Shamsunda, who was Shamsunda at the time. At that time Shamsunda was obviously having spiritual difficulties, and at least from the external point of view, he wasn't coming to Mangalati. It was pretty clear he wasn't chanting his rounds. He was out in the evenings. There wasn't much money, but he wanted to rent a car. And so he had this car, and I could have, the devotees were struggling to maintain themselves. And so there was some agitation at Shamsunda's behavior. So devotees were talking, but nobody would bring it to Srila Prabhupada's attention directly. So a particular devotee, senior devotee at the time, approached me and said, "You come to Prabhupada with me," because I agreed, well, Prabhupada at least should know that this is going on. If he doesn't know, how can, or maybe he knows. But I went along with it anyway. So I went in with this devotee, and actually it was Ribatanandan Swami. And because I had been his secretary or his servant, he took my support to go into Prabhupada with him. And we went in and paid our obeisances, and within a minute or two, Srila Prabhupada had understood our purpose. And he looked at me in disgust, actually. He was not happy that I'd come to complain. And when he realized that we were there just to complain about Shamsunda, he looked at Ribatanandan and he said, "Tell him to leave." Oh, no, sorry, excuse me. First of all, he looked at me and he said, "You should not criticize the superior Vaishnavas." Then, without talking to me anymore, he looked at Ribatanandan Swami and said, "You tell him to leave." So I crawled out on my stomach practically. I'd gone there to complain about Shamsunda and his inappropriate behavior as the GBC, and not knowing anything about Prabhupada's relationship with Shamsunda, how I'd taken this impertinent position, I realized after, and gone in to complain about one of his dear disciples. And that was all Prabhupada said. Do not criticize the superior Vaishnava. And then he looked at his other senior devotee and said, "You tell him to leave. I'm not even going to tell him to leave." He was always trying to give Krishna to somebody, whether it was in the form of a sweet, whether it was in some dialogue, whether it was in the form of his books, whether it was in the form of the deities, whether it was in the form of his disciples, giving you their association. He was always trying to create a situation where people would advance in Krishna consciousness. And, that's the greatest compassion. Constantly aware of people suffering, even they think they're happy. He could see beyond that. He understood everything. And he knew the only business in life was to give Krishna consciousness to other people. And I like to think he instilled a little of that in me. That morning he said that we are their good fortune, that you can also give this to people. He didn't say, I am their good fortune. I have come from India to give this knowledge. No, we are their good fortune. So that's also the humility. Prabhupada's humility, compassion. Krishna.